I am 60 years old, and 4 days after a doctor told me I had cancer, I watched my 3 grown children walk out my front door with their suitcases, and I understood, with a clarity that still aches to remember, exactly how much of my life I had spent believing love was something I had actually earned from them, rather than something I had simply hoped for. My name is Rosalind Bennett. Everyone has called me Ros since I was a girl. Except my late husband Harold, who called me Ros without the second syllable, a small private habit of his that I still catch myself listening for sometimes. 3 years after the heart attack that took him from me on an ordinary Tuesday morning, while he was tying his shoes in our front hallway. We were married 34 years. We raised 3 children in a modest but comfortable colonial in a suburb of Richmond, Virginia. Megan, our oldest, now 32, Adam, 30, and Trevor, 27. I want to tell this story honestly. Which means admitting that I had spent years quietly worrying about the particular shape my relationship with my children had taken since Harold died. Megan, sharp and ambitious, had always been the one who called the least and criticized the most, though I had spent years telling myself that was simply her personality, not a reflection of how she felt about me. Adam had moved to Denver for work and mostly kept in touch through the kind of brief, dutiful texts you send an obligation rather than a relationship. Trevor, the youngest, still lived close by, but even his visits had grown thin and hurried over the past 2 years, always arriving with some reason he couldn't stay long. I told myself, as mothers often do, that this was simply what happened as children grew into their own busy adult lives. I did not want to believe that the thinning of those visits reflected something colder underneath, an actual diminishment, in their eyes, of how much I mattered to them, now that I was no longer the center of a household they needed, simply a woman living alone in a house that had once been full. The diagnosis came on a Thursday in April. I had gone in for what I assumed would be a routine follow-up after a mammogram flagged something the radiologist wanted to look at more closely, and instead found myself sitting across from my longtime doctor, Sharon Liu, a woman I had trusted with my health for nearly 15 years, listening to her explain, gently but directly, that the biopsy had come back showing an early stage but confirmed breast cancer, one that would require further imaging, likely surgery, and a treatment plan we would need to discuss in detail once additional scans were complete. I do not remember much of the drive home that day. I remember calling Megan first because she is the oldest, and some old instinct in me still reached for her first in moments of crisis, the way you reach for a hand you've always reached for even after it stopped reliably reaching back. "Megan," I said, my voice unsteady in a way I couldn't fully control, "I need to tell you something. I was diagnosed with breast cancer today." There was a pause on the line, and then Megan's voice, careful but not, I would later realize, particularly warm. "Oh my God, Mom. Okay. What did they say exactly? Is it treatable? They think it's early stage, but I need more scans before they know exactly what we're dealing with." "Okay. Well, keep me posted. That's really scary, Mom, I'm sorry." I called Adam next, in Denver, and Trevor after that, and both conversations followed a similar shape. Genuine sounding concern in the first 30 seconds, followed quickly by a kind of practical distancing. Questions about logistics and timelines, rather than the raw, unfiltered fear I was actually feeling, and had hoped, somewhere in the quiet, aching part of me that still believed in unconditional love, that one of my children might actually sit with, rather than manage. I do not say this to suggest my children are monsters. I want to be fair, even now, even after everything that followed. Fear makes people behave strangely, and I understand, intellectually, that hearing your mother has cancer is frightening in ways that can make people retreat into practicality rather than open into vulnerability. I told myself, in the days that followed, that they simply needed time to process it. The way I needed time myself, what I did not expect, what I could not have prepared myself for, no matter how many years of quietly noticing their distance I had already logged away, was what happened 4 days later, when all 3 of them arrived at my house together, ostensibly to talk about next steps. I remember feeling a flicker of hope when I saw all 3 cars in my driveway that Monday evening. Some old, stubborn part of me thought, they've come together because they love me, because they want to face this as a family, because Whatever distance had grown between us these past few years is about to dissolve in the face of something that actually matters. I was wrong. And I understood how wrong within the first 5 minutes of them walking through my door. They did not come empty-handed. Megan, Adam, and Trevor all arrived with suitcases. Small, but suitcases nonetheless. The kind you pack for an overnight trip, not the kind you'd bring to sit with your sick mother in her own living room. I noticed this immediately, standing in my front hallway, and some part of me, even then, tried to construct an innocent explanation. Perhaps they were planning to stay the night. Perhaps this was a sign of support, not departure. We sat in my living room, the same living room where Harold and I had once decorated a Christmas tree every December for 3 decades, where I had rocked all 3 of them as infants, where I had only 4 days earlier sat alone after my diagnosis and cried until I had no tears left, and Megan, sitting across from me with a composure that I now recognize as rehearsed rather than natural, spoke first. "Mom," she said, "we've been talking, the 3 of us, and we think it's best if we don't get too deeply involved in this whole cancer situation right now." I remember blinking, genuinely confused. "What do you mean involved? I'm your mother. I have cancer." "What does involved even mean in this context?" "I mean," Megan said, her voice taking on an edge I had heard directed at other people before, but never quite at me, not with this particular coldness, that Adam has his job in Denver. I have the promotion I'm up for. Trevor's got his own stuff going on. None of us can really put our lives on hold for what could be a long, drawn-out situation. We just don't think it makes sense to reorganize everything around this right now. "I'm not asking you to reorganize your lives," I said, my voice cracking despite every effort to keep it steady. "I called you because I was scared, because I wanted my children to know what was happening to me. I wasn't asking anyone to move in or quit their jobs." "We know," Adam said, not quite meeting my eyes, "but realistically, Mom, this is probably going to involve appointments, treatments, recovery time, and none of us are really positioned right now to be, like primary caregivers or whatever. We think it's better to be honest about that up front instead of making promises we can't keep." I sat there, absorbing this, trying to understand how a conversation that began with me, hoping for comfort, had somehow become a formal, prepared announcement of my children's limited availability for my illness, delivered with the flat efficiency of a corporate memo. "So what exactly are you saying?" I asked, though some cold, sinking part of me already knew. Megan stood up first, and I watched her reach for the handle of her suitcase, and I understood, in that single physical gesture, everything that was about to happen. "We're saying," she said, "that we think it's better if we step back for now, let you focus on your treatment without feeling like you need to manage our reactions to it too. We'll check in. You're leaving," I said, the words coming out flat, disbelieving. "4 days after I told you I have cancer, you're leaving." "Mom, don't make this dramatic," Megan said, and then, in a tone I will remember for the rest of my life. A tone that revealed something about how she had genuinely come to see me that I had never once allowed myself to fully believe until that exact moment. She said, "We're not wasting time on a fading old woman's crisis right now. We all have our own lives to protect." The room went completely silent. I looked at Adam and Trevor, waiting for one of them to object, to soften what their sister had just said, to show any sign at all that they did not share the sentiment behind those words. Neither of them said anything. Adam looked at the floor. Trevor picked up his own suitcase. They grabbed their bags, all 3 of them. And within 20 minutes of arriving at my house, 20 minutes in the home where I had raised them, cooked 10,000 meals, sat up through fevers and heartbreaks and every ordinary crisis of their entire childhoods, they walked out my front door and drove away, leaving me alone in a living room that suddenly felt larger and colder than it ever had in 30 years of living in it. I do not fully remember how long I sat there after they left. I remember, at some point, my phone ringing, and I remember answering it on some kind of autopilot, still too stunned to process what had just happened. "Mrs. Bennett?" said a voice I recognized immediately, Dr. Sharon Liu, calling at an unusual hour. Her voice carrying a particular gravity that pulled me instantly out of the fog I'd been sitting in. "I'm so glad I caught you. I need to talk to you about something that came back from your additional imaging. And I think you're going to want to sit down for this." I was already sitting in the same chair I hadn't moved from in the 20 minutes since my children's cars had pulled out of my driveway. And something in Dr. Liu's voice made the hollow numbness I'd been sitting in sharpen abruptly into a different, more alert kind of fear. "I'm sitting down," I told her. "Rosalind, I want to walk you through this carefully. Because I know the initial diagnosis was frightening, and I don't want to create false hope or false alarm either way. We got the full pathology report back from the additional biopsy samples, along with the follow-up MRI. And there's something important I need you to understand." My heart was pounding. I braced myself, genuinely, for the worst possible version of this call, that the cancer had spread further than initially understood. That the situation was more dire than the first conversation had suggested. The initial biopsy sample, Dr. Liu continued, which showed the malignant cells, turned out to be from a very small, isolated area, and the additional samples, along with the MRI, are actually showing something we didn't expect. This appears to be an extremely early stage, highly localized instance of ductal carcinoma in situ, essentially. Precancerous or very early cancerous cells that have not spread beyond the milk duct itself. Given the specifics of your case, the oncology team and I believe this is very likely fully treatable with a relatively minor surgical procedure, quite possibly without any need for chemotherapy or radiation at all. I want to be careful not to overpromise because we'll know more after surgery, but Rosalind, this is genuinely about as good a version of a cancer diagnosis as it's possible to receive. Your prognosis, based on everything we're seeing, is excellent. I'd go so far as to say this is very likely to be a fully resolved situation within a matter of months. Not the kind of prolonged, life-altering battle the initial diagnosis might have suggested. I sat in that chair, phone pressed to my ear, and felt something crack open in my chest that I can only describe as a violent, disorienting collision of relief and grief happening at the exact same moment. Relief because the fear that had been sitting in my body for 4 days, the fear of dying, of leaving behind a life unfinished, was, according to my doctor's careful, measured words, very likely unwarranted, and grief, immediate and overwhelming, because 20 minutes earlier, my 3 children had walked out of my life, based on a version of this diagnosis that was, it turned out, far more dire than the reality, and none of them had stayed long enough to learn otherwise. "Rosalind, are you still there?" "I'm here," I said, my voice thick. I didn't know how to finish that sentence. "I'm just processing the fact that my children left me forever, 20 minutes ago, over a version of my illness that turned out not to be true, seemed both too complicated and too raw to say aloud to my doctor in that moment." "I know this is a lot to take in," Dr. Liu said gently, clearly reading something in my silence, though she couldn't have known the full shape of what had just happened in my living room. "Do you have someone with you right now? Family? A friend?" "No," I said, "not right now, but I'll be all right, Sharon. Thank you for calling so quickly." I hung up the phone and sat in that chair for a very long time, turning over the strange, cruel timing of what had just happened. My children had not left because I was dying. They had left because they believed, based on an incomplete understanding relayed in a few brief phone calls, that caring for me through cancer might be inconvenient, difficult, time-consuming, and they had decided as a united front that the theoretical burden of my illness was not worth staying for. Even for the length of a single conversation that might have revealed the actual situation was far less dire than they'd assumed. I called my closest friend Denise, a woman I'd known since our children were in elementary school together, and told her everything. The diagnosis, my children's departure, Megan's exact words. And finally the phone call from Dr. Liu that had just upended everything I thought I understood about the day. Denise was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "Ros," she finally said, "I need you to hear something, and I need you to actually let yourself hear it. Not just nod along the way you always do when someone tells you something about your kids that you don't want to be true. Your children didn't leave because the situation was dire. They left because they'd already decided, before they even had the full picture, that you weren't worth staying for. That's not about the cancer, that's about how they actually see you." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. I want to be honest about how painful it was to fully absorb, Not the abstract idea of it, which some quiet guarded part of me had perhaps suspected for years, but the specific undeniable evidence of it, delivered in my own living room. 20 minutes before a phone call that would have changed the entire tenor of that conversation had they simply stayed long enough to have it. Over the following days, I did not call my children to tell them the news. I want to explain why. Because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. Some part of me, in those first raw hours, genuinely considered calling immediately. Some old, deeply ingrained maternal instinct that still wanted, even then, to spare them the guilt of having abandoned me over a misunderstanding, to make the whole situation easier for them, the way I had spent my entire life making things easier for them, but a different, newer part of me, a part that had been quietly forming, I think, over the preceding years of thinning visits and dutiful texts, finally given full voice by the specific cruelty of Megan's exact words, recognized something important. My children had not asked a single clarifying question before deciding to leave. They had not asked what the follow-up scans might show, had not asked whether the situation might be more manageable than they assumed, had not in any way shown the curiosity or care that might have led them to wait even 20 more minutes to learn the actual shape-up of what I was facing. They had made their decision based entirely on their own calculation of inconvenience, not on any real understanding of my actual medical situation. Whether the diagnosis had turned out to be devastating or, as it happened, largely resolvable, their decision to leave would have been exactly the same. Made with exactly the same information, exactly the same haste, exactly the same cruelty in Megan's parting words. That understanding, more than anything else, shaped what I decided to do next.
I did not tell my children about Dr. Liu's call for 11 days. During that time, I underwent the recommended surgical procedure, a lumpectomy performed on a Wednesday morning, with Denise sitting beside me in the recovery room afterward, holding my hand in the exact way I had hoped. 4 days after my original diagnosis, one of my own children might have offered to do. The surgery went well. The follow-up pathology confirmed what Dr. Liu had suggested on the phone. Clean margins. No further spread. An excellent prognosis requiring only routine monitoring going forward, rather than the extended grueling treatment I had originally feared. I want to be honest. Even amid the relief of that outcome, persistent ache sat beneath everything. The specific grief of having walked through the most frightening medical experience of my life with a friend beside me instead of my own children, not because they were unavailable, but because they had actively chosen not to be. During those 11 days, I also did something else, something I had been quietly turning over in my mind since the moment Denise had said, so plainly, that my children's departure wasn't really about the cancer at all. I called my attorney, a careful, thoughtful man named Robert Kessler, who had handled Harold's and my estate planning for over a decade, and asked him to come by the house to discuss some changes I wanted to make. I want to be clear about my motivations here, because I think it matters. I was not acting out of pure spite, though I won't pretend some part of the decision wasn't shaped by the raw hurt of what had happened. I was acting, mostly, out of a clearer understanding of something I had spent years avoiding fully confronting. My estate. Built from 34 years of Harold's and my combined work, a comfortable but not extravagant sum, the house, some modest investments, a small life insurance payout from Harold's passing that I had never touched, had for years been structured to divide evenly among my 3 children upon my death, an arrangement I had put in place when they were still young enough that, even division, felt like the only fair, uncomplicated way to express equal love for 3 very different people. Sitting with Robert Kessler 11 days after my children walked out of my living room, I understood, with a clarity that felt both sad and necessary, that an estate plan built on an assumption of equal love and equal presence in my life no longer reflected the actual reality of my relationships with my 3 children, and that continuing to structure my affairs as though it did would be its own kind of quiet dishonesty. The same dishonesty I had been practicing for years by telling myself their distance meant nothing. I did not disinherit my children entirely. I want to be clear about that, because I know how a story like this can sound, and I don't want to suggest I acted purely out of anger rather than genuine reflection. What I did instead, over 3 careful meetings with Robert, was restructure my state to reflect something closer to the actual truth of my relationships, rather than an assumption I'd simply never revisited. A meaningful but reduced portion for each of my 3 children, and a new, significant provision for a scholarship fund in Harold's name at the community college, where he had once taught night classes in his final working years, along with a specific bequest to Denise, who had sat with me through a surgery my own children hadn't bothered about. I also did something else during those 11 days, something smaller but in its own way just as significant. I finally told my children about Dr. Liu's call. Not immediately, and not in the raw, reactive days following their departure, but once I had processed it fully myself, once the surgery was behind me. Once I had made my peace with the decisions I'd made about my estate, I sent a group text to all 3 of them, deliberately choosing text over a phone call. Because I did not want to give any of them the chance to manage my reaction to their reaction in real time, the way they had so carefully managed the delivery of their own departure 11 days earlier. I wanted to update you all on my health. The follow-up scans showed the cancer was very early stage and highly localized. I had a lumpectomy last week, and my doctor says my prognosis is excellent, likely no further treatment needed beyond routine monitoring. Denise was with me through the surgery and recovery. I'm doing well. The responses came within the hour, each one carrying a different flavor of the same underlying discomfort. Trevor called almost immediately. "Mom, that's such a relief. I'm so glad it wasn't as bad as we thought. I wish you'd called us, Wes." "You knew I was diagnosed with cancer 11 days ago, Trevor," I said, as gently as I could manage. "You didn't need to wait for an update to come. You chose to leave before we even knew what we were dealing with." He didn't have much of an answer for that. Adam texted rather than called. "Really glad to hear the good news. Mom, let me know if you need anything." I did not respond immediately. I found, in the days that followed, that I no longer had quite the same automatic instinct to reassure my children that everything between us was fine, simply because it made the moment easier for everyone involved. Megan's response took the longest to arrive, nearly a full day, and when it came, it was longer than the others, clearly more considered. "Mum, I'm really glad the news is good. I know what I said that day was harsh, and I've been thinking about it a lot since. I think we all reacted out of fear more than anything else, and I'm sorry if it felt like we abandoned you." I read that message several times before responding, turning over exactly how honest I wanted to be, and eventually deciding that honesty, however uncomfortable, was the only response that would actually mean anything at this point. "Megan, I appreciate you saying that. But I want to be honest with you, because I think honesty is the only thing that will actually help us going forward. You didn't react out of fear in a way that made you stay close and scared beside me. You reacted by deciding, within 4 days of my diagnosis, that I wasn't worth the inconvenience of staying to find out what we were actually facing. That's a different thing than fear. I've spent this past week thinking hard about what that means for how I structure the rest of my life going forward, and I've made some decisions about that. I hope we can rebuild something real between us. But I'm not going to pretend that day didn't reveal something true about how you see me, because pretending it didn't happen would only teach you that it's safe to treat me that way again." I did not receive an immediate response, and I did not expect one. Some conversations require time to be absorbed rather than answered quickly.
"It has been 14 months now, since the day my 3 children walked out of my living room with their suitcases, 20 minutes before a phone call that would have changed everything about how that day unfolded, had they simply stayed to hear it. I want to be honest about where things stand now, because I think Asis deserves an honest ending rather than a neatly resolved one. My relationship with my children has not returned to what it once was, nor do I believe it should. Given what I now understand about the reality beneath the surface of those relationships for years before this crisis ever forced it into the open, Trevor has made the most consistent effort to rebuild something real. He visits monthly now, calls more often, and has, on more than one occasion, sat with me through the kind of ordinary vulnerability neither of us had made much room for before that day. I believe he is genuinely trying, and I have tried in turn. To meet that effort honestly,
without either punishing him further for the past or pretending it didn't happen. Adam remains distant, in the same way he has largely always been distant since moving to Denver. Though our communication has become slightly more frequent, if not appreciably warmer. I have made peace with the possibility that some relationships simply settle into a permanently lower register once a truth like this has been spoken aloud between two people, and that this too is a kind of honest resolution. Even if it isn't the one I once hoped for, Megan and I have had several difficult, necessary conversations since that first exchange of texts, conversations that have been more honest, in some ways, than anything we managed to say to each other in the years before my diagnosis. I do not believe our relationship will ever fully return to what it once was, but I believe cautiously that what exists between us now is more real than what existed before, built on an actual reckoning with what happened, rather than the polite, careful distance we had both been quietly maintaining for years without ever naming it honestly. I finalized the changes to my estate plan 4 months after that day, changes that reflect, as honestly as I know how, the actual shape of the relationships in my life rather than an assumption of equal presence that the facts no longer supported. I do not view this as punishment. I view it as finally an honest accounting of where love and presence have actually shown up in my life, rather than where I once assumed by default they always would. Denies remains one of the great, unexpected gifts of this entire ordeal, a friendship that has deepened into something closer to family in the months since she sat beside me through a surgery my own children hadn't thought to ask about. We have dinner every Sunday now. A tradition that began quietly in the weeks after my surgery and has simply never stopped. I am 60 years old. I built a family, raised 3 children, buried a husband I loved for 34 years, and then, in the space of a single Monday evening, learned exactly how thin the ground beneath certain kinds of love can turn out to be when it's finally tested by something real. I do not regret the honesty that followed, however painful it was to arrive at. I do not regret restructuring my life around the truth of who actually showed up for me, rather than who I once assumed always would. People sometimes ask me if I've forgiven my children for what happened that day. I tell them the truth. Forgiveness for me has never been about pretending something didn't happen or wasn't as bad as it felt in the moment. It has been about deciding honestly and clearly what kind of relationship I'm willing to rebuild going forward, and with whom, based not on old assumptions of unconditional loyalty, but on an honest accounting of who has actually chosen to show up since. 20 minutes. That is how long it took my 3 children to leave a home built on 30 years of love. 20 minutes before a phone call would have told them the situation was far less dire than they'd assumed. I have thought many times since about what it means that 20 minutes was more than they were willing to give me, and about what it means, in turn, that I have spent the 14 months since finally learning to give myself the patience, the honesty, and the self-respect that no one else in that room was willing to offer me that day.